Let's look at food labels to evaluate fat content. I will say again, and we talked about this in the best choices lecture and carbohydrate labels. Number one, eat foods without a label. But when you do have a food that contains a label, understand it. Make sure you know what it is that you're getting out of it. And so let's address fat and what we're looking for on a label for that. You will look at serving size, calories. There's many components of the food label: cholesterol, total carbohydrates, protein. But when we're looking at fat, there's just a little bit of information that we have here. It tells us total fat, saturated fat, trans fat. In the middle label, you'll see it does not contain trans fat. That is more recently a requirement on the food label, so you will see that now on all current labels. Occasionally, you'll see a label that does list monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat, but that is not a requirement, so it is not very commonly found on your food label. You can see on the label on the left, walnuts, total fat 18 grams. The percent daily value on the right, it says that's 28% of a day's intake of total fat. That is based on a 2,000 calorie diet. I don't pay too much attention to that. I want people to be able to understand grams a little bit better because I think that's just more useful information. Not everybody consumes a 2,000 calorie diet, so it really only applies for that certain population. Total fat, 18 grams of 190 calories. Walnuts are a good source of fat, so we're getting a lot of the calories coming from total fat. But what's important to recognize in this is that very little of that is coming from saturated fat. So most of it is coming from unsaturated fat. I mentioned walnuts being one of our good sources of omega-3 polyunsaturated fats. They also are a source of monounsaturated fat. So we know in comparison, total's 18, 1.5 is saturated, so the remainder is going to be unsaturated. We don't know the breakdown of mono and poly, but we know most of it is monounsaturated. So or we know it's unsaturated, not necessarily mono. So that gives us a good idea that this is a decent choice. It's definitely a high fat food, but the quality of fat is good, heart healthy fat. The pizza in the middle label, 13 grams of total fat, 6 of that coming from saturated fat. So we have a much higher percentage of that total coming from saturated. 320 calories, it's also a good source, of course, of carbohydrates and protein. Not a very high fat food, but most of it is coming from more of a saturated fat. So we'd like to make a choice that's less in the saturated fat category. And then the one on the right is a goat cheese, total fat 5 grams, saturated fat 3.5 grams. The pizza and, of course, the cheese is where we're getting most of that fat from as well. Animal sources, again, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, mostly coming from those saturated fats. We don't get as much unsaturated fat from animal sources, but we can compare, again, labels, as we talked about in the carbohydrate. We can compare labels and see, of this pizza brand or of this cheese, what is the difference between these two products and which might be the best choice that I can make. We're basically just looking at total, saturated versus unsaturated versus trans, and we'll get into more detail in the next lecture on how do we calculate that and how do we make recommendations on that total quantity of fat.